I'm Haley Boyle, the Vice President of Programs here at the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Unfortunately, our CEO, Craig, was unable to join us this evening, so I'm here to pinch hit. Before we get to tonight's discussion, I'd like to draw your attention to some of our upcoming programs this month. On February 19th, we'll have a panel discussion on U.S. national security in the world today. That event will feature MSNBC's Malcolm Nance along with several other panelists. Then on February 25th, we'll be showing the documentary In the Name of Peace, John Hume in America, about the man who is widely considered the architect of the Northern Ireland peace process. We hope that you'll consider joining us for these important events and look forward to seeing you later this month. Tonight, we're delighted to gather for a discussion with Karen Sherman, author of the book Brick by Brick, Building Hope and Opportunity for Women Survivors Everywhere. She's president of the Aquila Institute, Rwanda's first women's college and East Africa's preeminent higher education institution for women. Karen has spent her life advocating for women in war-torn and transitional countries such as Iraq, Bosnia, Rwanda, South Sudan, Kosovo, and the former Soviet Union. Throughout her 30-year career in global development, Sherman has met and interviewed thousands of women. Tonight, Karen is here to share some of these remarkable stories of strength, courage, resilience, and resourcefulness that fuel what she believes to be true. Championing women's education and economic participation has the power to transform the lives of women and the future of families, communities, and societies around the world. Following our discussion, Karen's book will be available for sale, and she's graciously agreed to stay and sign copies. We'll have time at the end for some audience Q&A, but first, please join me in welcoming Karen Sherman.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a rainy night. I'm sorry it's not particularly nice, but hopefully it's worth the effort. I want to thank you for the kind introduction and also for some of my family members to be here. So Brick by Brick tells the story of the year I uprooted my family and moved to Rwanda with my 3 sons for my job with Women for Women International, an organization that helps women survivors of war and conflict rebuild their lives. I had worked at Women for Women for almost a decade, traveling back and forth to many of the world's most conflict-ridden countries: Afghanistan, Bosnia, Iraq, Kosovo, Nigeria, Rwanda, and South Sudan, places where women suffered extreme violence and insecurity due to war and often a more brutal aftermath. As someone who has straddled the developed and developing world for most of my professional career, the comfort and ease of our lives in Bethesda, Maryland, clashing with the excessive hardships and insecurities in many of the places I worked, some of the worst places on earth to be a woman, I wanted to share some of what I've learned from other women, particularly with other women, in Brick by Brick. The fact is, there are too many women around the world who still lack voice and choices, unable to make or contribute to the very decisions which impact their lives. In many countries, for example, even simple choices about what to wear, how much to eat, when and with whom to leave their homes, let alone bigger choices around education, work, children, money, even sex, are out of reach for women. It was like that for Cecilia in Rwanda. Her husband would actually count the pieces of meat she ate to make sure that she didn't consume more than her perceived worth. And Remza in Kosovo, who became the head of household after her husband died in the war. She had never left home before without a male relative by her side. You know, I've talked with thousands of women like Cecilia and Remza. I've listened to their stories, met their husbands and children, visited their homes and places of work. And I've learned something about their motivations and challenges, and really how they've been able to lift themselves up, often a brick at a time. And I've included a few of their stories in this book alongside my own, in hopes that you may gain understanding and inspiration too. So I started to work on Brick by Brick when we came back from Rwanda after that year there, often during the dark and quiet hours of 4 and 6 a.m. and pretty much every weekend, in between my new job as president of the Aquila Institute and raising our twins, Sam and Eli, and our youngest, Kai, basically the rest of life. I was fortunate to have the full support of my family, including my parents and siblings, even as I was dredging up some uncomfortable family memories. But for me, writing this book was a time-consuming and labor-intensive process, but it was also a labor of love. So how did we end up in Rwanda? That is the story. The catalyst for our move was my lost bid to become CEO of Women for Women. To me, the work was so much more than a job. Moving women survivors of war from crisis and poverty to stability and economic self-sufficiency just felt right to me, like what I was supposed to be doing. Many of these women had truly lost everything, husbands, children, livelihoods, and had their dignity stripped away by atrocities on a scale most of us can't even imagine. There was Christina in Rwanda, who watched as her husband and 5 children were killed with a machete in the genocide. And Elizabeth in South Sudan, who took her marriageable daughter away so that she could continue going to school. When she told the authorities that she didn't know where her daughter was, they beat her, broke her leg and 4 ribs, and threw her in jail for a year. And Ivan in Iraq, who lost her husband and her father in the same night while trying to flee the bombing in Baghdad. When their car was attacked, Ivan had to drag both her husband and her father away from the wreckage, and in the process, some of her husband's internal parts were splayed in the street. He was the first to die, and her father died soon after. And Safeta in Bosnia. She lived a comfortable life before the war with her husband and his parents, awaiting the birth of their first child. When the city fell under siege, her husband was taken as a prisoner of war and forced into hard labor. One night, Safeta's once friendly neighbors turned soldiers kidnapped her and brought her to an empty house where they repeatedly tortured and raped her. One of them suggested that they kill her, but another said no, that she would kill herself. After she was released, the only thing that kept Safeta alive was her infant son. I had to live for him, she said. And there were so many more. And we never saw or treated these women as victims, women who were helpless or to be pitied. Instead, they were viewed as potential agents of change, capable of transforming their lives and in turn the lives of their families and communities. That message, that women are inherently capable and powerful in spite of their circumstances, resonated with me from the very beginning for reasons I couldn't explain at the time. The work had become so integral to my sense of identity that the program's key outcomes, that women are well, that women are decision makers, that women have rebuilt social networks and safety nets, and women earn and sustain an income, had become my personal outcomes. My family was waiting for me to get over it and move on, but the rejection had taken a toll. On the cusp of turning 50, I felt myself falling into the cliche of a midlife crisis. Everything, it seemed, was falling apart, including my 25-year marriage. We seemed to have it all on the surface. We made a comfortable living and had 2 successful, meaningful careers. The kids were all healthy and seemed to be thriving. It should have been enough, and yet somehow it wasn't. With so many women suffering around the world, it felt self-indulgent to be anything less than grateful for my lot, for the myriad of personal and professional choices at my disposal, for my life of privilege and abundance. But the fact of it was, I had lost my joy for life and this work. I realized that if my future were to include joy, I would likely have to search for it. I would have to understand what went wrong and try to do things differently. The word change began to grow inside my brain. An idea began to percolate. To get myself to a better place, I might actually need to live in another place, and I wanted the boys to come with me. And that place, it turned out, was Rwanda. So why Rwanda? Has anybody in this room been to Rwanda? Yes. So you may know, in 1994, close to 1 million Tutsi were brutally murdered over 100 days of unimaginable violence and inhumanity. And upwards of 300,000 women were sexually violated, tortured, and mutilated during the genocide, systematically used as weapons of war. The country was completely destroyed. Rwanda's story, though, doesn't start nor end with the genocide. Since then, it has developed and even thrived, with women seeing some of the biggest gains. Poverty rates are down and life expectancy is up. And there have been dramatic improvements in areas like maternal and child mortality. Today, Rwanda has one of the fastest growing economies in East Africa and serves as a model for human development across the region. Most importantly, it is safe. The organization was building the first of its kind Women's Opportunity Center there as a hub for learning and commerce for women in the community, and needed someone to oversee construction and run point on other operations in Africa. Rwanda was a place where I could still do my job and be more of an actual parent than a virtual one, where the boys could experience a new culture and community. I hoped they would gain a better appreciation for how and where they lived, and the breadth of choice that they have back home and took for granted, as so many of us do. So why did I want to write this book? After 30 years of work in the developing world, there are two things I've learned that make a fundamental difference in the lives of women and girls everywhere, that enable their voices and choices. The first is an education, and the second is the ability to earn an income. The two must go hand in hand. Why? Education alone is insufficient to change the status quo for women and girls. But when access to knowledge is combined with access to resources, education, and income, it can lead to lasting change, not only for the women themselves, but for their families, communities, and societies. I've witnessed the power and impact on education and income on women again and again, and the ripple effects that extend well beyond them. Together they drive agency, the ability to have and make their own choices. For women, this can be choices around how money is saved and spent, choices around sending and keeping your kids, and particularly girls, in school, choices when a woman is suffering from violence and abuse in the family. Take Teresa, for example, one of the women profiled in my book. She was 16 when she was forced to drop out of school after her father's death, leaving her mother to try and raise her and her 10 siblings. Sometimes the family went hungry. She then got married to a neighbor and had 5 children in quick succession. Teresa depended on her husband for everything. He wouldn't give her permission to go to the market like other women, so after growing crops, she was not allowed to harvest and sell them. I was the type of woman who just lives in the house, she said. When Teresa joined Women for Women's program and received training in agriculture, she heard testimonials from other women about going into business, and they encouraged her. Teresa then started several businesses. She bought and sold cows. She managed a small banana plantation and started 2 fish ponds, and she opened a bar and restaurant in the town center. So her businesses began to turn a profit. She bought land and she built a house for her family. They even had enough for a new television set and a generator. My neighbors used to say demonic things about me, that I am not peaceful, Teresa told me. They were not used to seeing a woman make money, riding a bike, or taking a moto to the market. I silenced them, though, by showing them all the things that I'm doing. With Teresa's help and example, most of her neighbors started their own small income generating projects. She now has a swamp where she cultivates rice and bananas with the help of a few workers from the community, and every Saturday she goes to the market to sell. 2 of Teresa's daughters are in a private day school, and her other children are in a government school. She wants them to continue their education, but also to be able to earn an income. And her story is just one example of a woman gaining voice and choices through income generation. There are so many others. And I saw this issue play out in my own family. My dad was a traveling salesman working in the wholesale sporting goods business started by his father. They sold hip waders, heavy boots, thick flannel shirts, and the like. So his days were spent calling on mom and pop stores up and down the Pacific Northwest, where I grew up. But when my dad was at home, he would berate my mother incessantly, belittle her for all her inadequacies, a missing knife, a messy drawer, Nothing was too small to escape his notice or condescension. She was the subject of everything that was wrong with his life. His financial concerns for the business, his frustrations working for his harsh and condemning father. My siblings and I also endured his physical and verbal abuse, but my mother took the brunt of it. At the time, I couldn't understand why she would tolerate such demeaning behavior or stay in a marriage that clearly wasn't working. Why didn't she do something or say something? Where was her voice? Much, much later, I had my answer. I had to put up with a lot of nasty stuff, my mom told me. But where could I go with 3 children and no money of my own? I couldn't go home to my mother. There really was no choice, she said finally. Euphrasia, a Rwandan woman whose husband abused her and gave her little to eat because she didn't contribute financially, had said virtually the same thing when I asked her why she stayed with him. I had no means to take care of the children by myself, she said. I had no choice. As I reflected more on my upbringing over our time in Rwanda, I started to connect the dots. You would have thought it, given what I do, that I would have done that sooner. But I came to see my father's abuse for what it was, a pattern I'd seen again and again in the women I met. Through them, I was finally able to comprehend my mother's missing voice, her lack of choice. I also realized just how much we women, at our core, have in common, regardless of place or circumstance. A shared desire to be treated with decency and respect, to support and educate our children, to live a life free of violence, abuse, and harassment, in peace and with dignity, to believe in a better future. Beyond continents and cultures, war and peace, what separates us truly is choice, the ability to choose, from the simplest expression of our daily preferences to the more profound life-changing choices that separate us as women and mothers and human beings. This is true for Afghan women, where women and girls in Kabul are gaining access to an education and economic and political opportunities, but outside of the capital are subject to a different set of rights and restrictions that limit their freedom and endanger their lives. Where 87% of women are reported to have experienced at least some form of abuse, at least half of them at home. And for Congolese women, the majority of whom live in extreme poverty with limited access to food, services, and medicine, where more than 2 million women have been raped over the country's protracted war, a scale so staggering it defies comprehension. And for South Sudanese women, where a woman is more likely to die in childbirth than to finish primary school. Think about it, more likely to die in childbirth than to finish primary school. And food, shelter, and education, the most basic of human rights, are considered negotiables for women, with men exercising all the levers of control. And for women in Rwanda, which boasts the highest percentage of women in parliament anywhere in the world, and yet the majority of women still work as subsistence farmers, earning less than $2 a day. And women are expected to take a back seat to their husbands at home. And in the U.S., where 1 in 16 women experience rape as their first sexual encounter, 1 in 16 women, where women with full-time jobs still earn roughly 77% of what their male counterparts earn. The truth is that for all the progress for women worldwide, and there has been progress, the gap between places where women have real choices and where they don't is still too wide. Today, 1 billion girls and women around the world still lack the education and skills they need to participate in the labor market. 40 million women and girls in Africa still marry before their 15th birthday. 1 out of every 3 women worldwide are survivors of violence. And 4 out of 5 victims of human trafficking are girls. Of course, there are faces behind every single number. And you know that most of the world's unpaid care and domestic labor is done by women and girls, which impacts their ability to not only stay in school and engage in paid work, but also their empowerment and agency. That women's employment rates globally are either stagnant or on the decline. and there remains a significant digital gender divide. The data shows that current barriers to women's education and employment, which include poverty and cultural norms and early marriage and pregnancy, may be exacerbated by technologies and other shifts in the global economy. That in terms of the future of work, there's the potential to leave even more women and girls behind without actively working to close access, skill, and technology gaps. We have an opportunity to change these statistics. It's one of the reasons that I joined the Aquila Institute 6 years ago and still believe so strongly in its education model today. Rather than starting with the supply, underserved women in need of skills and employment, Aquila starts with the demand, the skills gap in the current and future labor market, and works backwards so that young women graduate ready to assume leadership roles in the workplace and society. 86% of Aquila graduates, most of whom come from rural areas and are the first in their families to go to college, secured jobs within 6 months of graduation, and they're earning incomes which average 11 times the national median income. But here's the most important part. 81% of those young women are paying for health care or school fees for other family members. And so we see that multiplier effect already happening. Women like Nadine, who barely survived the genocide as a 3-year-old and was raised by a single mother. Sometimes she didn't have a job, so we'd go without food for several days. She talks about having her mother being afraid of letting her go to school because she was afraid she'd find her passed out on the side of the road because she hadn't had enough to eat. And she's like, "I'm okay, Mom, I've got this." She wanted to get an education so she could help her and her family move on to a better life. And Aisha, who begged and begged her father, a practicing Muslim with several wives, to be allowed to go to school. She became the only girl in her family to study up to university. And Sandrine, who parlayed her love of computers into an information systems degree and a career as a software engineer. We know that education and income are game changers for women and girls, enabling them to become empowered and independent, to have a life of their own choosing. But it's also good for society. You may know that women typically reinvest the majority of their earnings in the health, education, and nutrition of their families. That each additional year of schooling a woman receives not only increases her future earning potential, it also supports more positive and inclusive economic growth as women launch and lead businesses and contribute to the local economy. And educating women and girls is also considered one of the top solutions to climate change, according to a coalition that researches climate change solutions. Educated women marry later, they have fewer children, and can be more effective stewards of the environment. They also have greater resiliency in the face of extreme weather events. And women's economic participation can help mitigate future conflicts. Studies show that countries with higher female workforce participation are less likely to experience internal conflict and less likely to use military force to resolve international conflict. Simply put, when women are educated and earn incomes, whole families benefit, society benefits. During the year my son and I lived in Rwanda, a year that challenged everything I believed about my role, my purpose, my family and relationships, I drew particular strength from the women survivors that I worked with. Whereas I had been looking for the big gesture, the recognition that I felt I had earned, they taught me that it is often the smallest gestures, the heart-catching moments that remind us of who we are and of our humanity that matter the most. These women rebuilt their lives one step, one small change, and in the case of the women brickmakers, who handmade every single one of the 500,000 bricks used to construct the Women's Opportunity Center, brick by brick. The stories of loss and survival opened my eyes in a new way, not only to the depths of human suffering, but to the resiliency and the special commonality of women across all types and walks of life. They caused me to reflect more deeply than I ever had before on my own difficult upbringing and my struggles over the years in my marriage and as a mom. These survivors showed me the true meaning of compassion, how it could be turned inward as well as outward, and what it means to be victimized without being a victim. From them, I discovered how to finally move past the past. The insights their example provoked may have saved my family from breaking apart, just as they helped me to find my way home. Though 6 years have passed since our time in Rwanda, our family was forever changed by our experiences there. Kai, our youngest, finishes high school this year with a deep interest in social justice, and the twins will be graduating from college. Eli, a global studies major, interned in Rwanda last summer with an organization working to combat childhood malnutrition. And Sam, our budding engineer, spent 2 summers in Swaziland building footbridges to help isolated communities gain access to medical care, schools, and markets. I could not be more proud of each of them and their choices. You know, one of the hardest parts for me of writing Brick by Brick was trying to find the right balance in the story between the personal and the professional narrative, between the work I do and the rest of life. But that is life, and it's how so many of us women choose to live it. It may not always be pretty, but it can be very satisfying. Rwanda deepened my sense of perspective and appreciation for what it takes to be a woman almost anywhere in the world today, even when that womanhood is threatened or diminished by one's family, culture, or society. It also gave me the courage to look inside, to forgive and accept who I am, and to do some things differently for the sake of my family. While making tough choices can be daunting, as it was for me at first, that very act of choosing, especially for women, is really the great privilege of our lives. That message is the reason I wanted to write this book. Thank you.
Karen has agreed to take questions. If anybody has one, I will come to you with the microphone.
Thank you first for bringing the lives of these women to our attention and with such empathy. I'm just wondering, you were talking about how many of the women were really controlled in their most minute kinds of activities during the day by their husbands. And then that they might not even be able to go out by themselves. So did you look at all at how the husbands reacted when the organizations proposed that they get education and was going to help them learn more about agriculture, etc.? Because it seems what I have seen in, mostly India, but other places too, is that husbands can be very jealous.
Yeah.
And, you're taking time away from me when you're going and volunteering to help other women or to learn something.
Yeah.
And the husbands are losing control.
Yeah.
So how
do we do with
how
that?
do you deal with that?
No, it's such a great question. And it's funny, when we launched our program so many years ago at Women for Women, the women would tell us, well, it's great that you're training us and you're giving us all these new skills, but if I'm going back into the same dynamic with my husbands, my brothers, my uncles, my cousins, you haven't really changed anything. And so they're like, you need to train them. And so at the time, Women for Women started a men's leadership program for exactly that reason, so that they weren't hearing from us, but what we did was we took male community leaders. They could be religious leaders, political leaders, policemen. They could be anybody from the community, not us, but from other men, about why it was important to go through this program and what it meant to their families and their wives. And I remember being in Nigeria one time, sitting with a group of men who had been through this program, and they said, we didn't know. We didn't know that that there was a different way to treat women, to engage with women. And, you know, their fathers had done that to their wives, and their mothers were treated like that. So there was a question of breaking the cycle. And I remember being in South Sudan, too, where, you know, we had invited some women to come to the program, and one of the women was not allowed to come. He was very worried that what she would learn would turn her against him. But when he heard from other men in the community what their wives were learning, he actually brought her back to the program and says, could you train her too? So I think there's not a massive systemic solution here, but I think engaging men and training men and bringing them along for the reasons exactly that you mentioned are just as important as training women.
So obviously your experiences abroad were completely life-changing and very different from anything you're experiencing here. Seeing how the U.S. still has its fair share of issues, what are a couple things that you brought back that really changed your life and the way you go about your day-to-day life and the way you interacted with your family that really feel like they brought you back to where you felt you needed to be and improved your life in the States?
Oh, so many things. I think it's really just this sense of humility and this sense of community. I think when I first went to Rwanda, you know, and I think so many of us do, like, I can do this by myself. I don't need anybody. I'm a strong woman. I don't need my family. I don't need other women to help me. And that changed dramatically because I was solo parenting for the first time with our 3 boys in Rwanda, who at the time were 14 years old, the twins and the 11-year-old, and I was going off while we were in Rwanda to South Sudan and Congo and dealing with crises in a lot of those countries. And I realized I needed other people. I needed other women. I got a lot of support from my friends in Rwanda. I needed my husband, probably more than I cared to admit. And I think I needed the community. I needed the community of support. And that was really eye-opening for me. I talked about the 4 key outcomes at Women for Women, about wellness and decision-making and earning an income. This whole question of women having social networks and safety nets. I hadn't really internalized that till we lived in Rwanda, and I've carried that with me as I've come home, and I've built much stronger relationships in my community, with my family, with other women, as a result of that time there, and that will stay with me forever.
I'd like to thank you for the work that you do. And it's interesting, I've always supported financially Women for Women, not, you know, over the past probably more than 10 years. A couple questions I have. One is the situation and the border in Central America and women fleeing. And I know right now, I don't know if that's an area that you've studied more recently, but a lot of the women who are claiming asylum or escaping abuse situations. But I know now that the government now is not considering that as a viable thing to present for asylum. So I didn't know if you were familiar with anyone that's doing that work and what your feelings are about that.
No, I mean, I've been following it. I haven't done much work in that region, but I definitely follow that. And to me, it points to the universal story of women, actually, that, you know, women typically don't have an ability to leave an abusive situation without their own resources, which is why I feel so strongly about women being able to earn an income, whether it's my mother in the situation that she found herself in, or a woman in Rwanda, or a woman in Central America. And I'm not equating suffering or situation and saying that they're all the same. I'm really talking about having a choice about what you do in a circumstance like that, where you feel powerless. And, you know, the alternative for these women in Central America is they're stuck, right? If they can't come here, they're stuck in their circumstances. I suspect they don't have resources to be able to leave their situation and their families. No, it's heartbreaking.
It makes so much sense to me, the sort of two pillars of what you're, what you found in all of your work. And I'm just wondering, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me that women being able to earn an income have better, ability to sort of shape their families. And I'm just sort of wondering, in so many of the stories that you've told and your experiences, women really are reluctant to leave because of their families and because of their children. And just there's, challenges in a lot of places with respect to like reproductive freedom and that type of choice. And I'm just wondering sort of how you saw that factor in and just kind of how you can also help women, on that front.
Yeah, I mean, it's all connected up in some ways in the sense that, what I was talking about, the statistics for, the longer a woman stays in school and completes school, she has fewer children, right? So it does help with family planning. And obviously, if women are able to feed and clothe and educate her children, it leads to better outcomes for her children as well. And so the multiplier effect of keeping young women in school longer is important. But some may disagree with me, but I also believe that the kind of education a woman receives matters. It isn't just enough to check the box and put her in school and say, well, she graduated from school. But if she doesn't have the skills to be able to engage with the workforce or get a job, then you've just really perpetuated the same situation. And the thing I find most heartbreaking is for a woman to graduate from secondary school, to have pushed through secondary school and then have no opportunity either to join the workforce or to go on to tertiary education and increase her outcomes. So you've created this expectation, this potential for a better life, and then you're at home. I was in Malawi in early November, and there are so many young women in that situation. And they had this taste of this possibility there, and then they're not going on to school. They're not entering the workforce. They're back at home, where 85% of the people live in rural areas, where 10% of the country is electrified. And that's your life. You're going to get married. You're going to be helping your family, your husband's family likely in his home, and that's it. So that's why I say the two must go hand in hand. And the way I think about it, that gives women choice.
Thanks so much for this talk. Obviously, Women for Women and the Aquila Institute are international institutions. How do you think about local partners in your effort to bring people in and ensure that you're meeting the needs of a specific community?
You mean local here?
No, when you've listed many different countries, you've talked about
Yep.
different programs in different countries. How are you tailoring it to the needs of that specific community that you're in?
All of our team in Rwanda is Rwandan, with the exception of a couple of people. From the president on down. And so in terms of our faculty, for example, at the Aquila Institute, over half of them are from Rwanda. The rest are from East Africa. So we really make sure that it is a local program. In addition, we didn't import curriculum from the U.S. or from other countries. That curriculum was locally developed so that it aligned to the needs of the people that we were serving, but also the local market opportunities, because, it has to be market relevant. And so that's how we make sure that happens, and of course have local partners that we work with on the ground there too. Women for Women did that too. One of the things that drew me to the program initially was they didn't hire a bunch of expats and plop them in other countries. They hired local nationals wherever they worked. And from a development standpoint, I feel like that's much more impactful and the way it should be done.
Hi.
Hi.
So my first question, I think it's somewhat related to the second, is how did you get buy-in from the leadership of the organizations? And second, once you get in the buy-in for the leadership, what kind of messages did they share to the men in the community? Because you're like fundamentally changing the culture that is so ingrained into them.
Buy-in from men, you mean?
Yeah, so how'd you get the buy-in first from the leadership? So from like the politicians, the religious leaders, and then secondary, what kind of messages did they share to people that weren't ingrained into the leadership, but, just like any of the men, like the guy that wouldn't let his wife go to the market? How did you get him to change his mind?
As I say in the book, shag za shagam, step by step. We really worked to engage, find those key leaders who were most influential and sat down with them and really explained the program, that it wasn't about turning women away from men at all or from the family dynamic, but that it was giving the family new opportunities, and that women were helping to build stronger families, stronger marriages, stronger family dynamics, that often when women were earning an income, they're bringing the entire family, their husbands, cousins, brothers, into these businesses, that it helped everyone prosper. And so those key messages really resonated. I think the fear by male leaders and in certain communities is that you're going to be destroying families. You're going to have a bunch of women getting up in arms and leaving their families and leaving their situations. And actually, what we heard over and over again from women is that my husband doesn't beat me anymore. My husband treats me with more respect because I'm bringing in money to the family. We make decisions together now. And I'm not saying this is a universal, but by and large, those were some of the things that we heard from other women. And so when that message gets out, and those messages are disseminated from family to family, community to community, you start seeing systemic change happen at that level.
Thank you for your time. How did you address the trauma? It sounds like these people went through a tremendous amount of trauma, and whether it's human trafficking or whatever, how was that part of what you did?
That's a good question. Worked in some of those most difficult places, Congo especially. I remember the whole Women for Women model is built around training in groups of 25, and it's done very intentionally because a lot of these women have come, they're rape victims, they're single heads of households, they're IDPs and internally displaced people. And I remember our director of programs at the time said some of these women are so traumatized when they first come to the program, they can't even say their names out loud. Think about that. So they come into these groups, and our trainers used to work as, they're like social workers too, and they're used to trauma counseling. So the idea of this training is that it helps them to feel comfortable enough to share their stories, many of them for the first time, and to also feel like they're not alone. I think one of the things that you see in places like Congo is there's a lot of shame and humiliation about the rapes. And unfortunately, what you see in a lot of those environments is these women being ostracized from their families after those rapes occur, like it's their fault. And so, you're just compounding that shame. And so, the program brings them in and allows them to share their stories, many for the first time. And it's really healing. I actually learned, not just in Congo, but in some of these other contexts, the group piece was actually, in some ways, equally important to the training itself and what these women were learning.
Hi, thank you very much. I think along those same lines, so how did you deal with the children? Was there any training or special attention given to the children of these women?
We didn't, except that women were allowed to bring their children to the training because sometimes there was nobody else to watch the kids, and we didn't want that to be a reason that they couldn't attend. So they would rotate sometimes and take turns watching each other's kids while they were at the training programs, and so you would see some of them there. And even at Aquila, when we first started the college, child pregnancy, early pregnancy was a big issue, and so one of the things that we did was open a creche, childcare in the college itself. We did not want the fact that you might have a child to be an obstacle to getting an education. I think you just have to meet women where they are and create opportunities for them with the children. And in terms of sort of the children's future development, that's really in the hands of the women. And a lot of the women were explicitly there, whether you're talking about Women for Women or Aquila, to help their children go on to have a better life. And so that was being passed down through them.
Hi.
Hey.
you talked a little bit about this, but the journey to the structure of the book and, weaving your own story in, I'm curious, like, what came first? Was it a desire to tell these stories of these women, or to tell your own story? And when did they come together?
That's a very good question. I'd been doing, and I've always collected women's stories. That was one of my jobs. Story collection is a means of data collection. And so part of my job was to go out and to collect women's stories. And so I had literally notebooks, still have notebooks full of them. And so I just felt that there was a story that I wanted to tell as somebody who had straddled those worlds. And so I wanted to tell the stories, but, honestly, I felt it would be disingenuous to tell these women's stories without being willing to tell my own story and laying it alongside these other women's stories, because, these women had shared very personal and intimate details with me about their lives, and I felt like I should do the same in terms of this story. So, but I did struggle with, like, how much should be their story? How much should be my story? How do I weave my story in a way that makes sense? And plus, this is my first book. I really literally did not know what I was doing. And so, I went over it and over it and over it to try and get the balance between the personal and the professional right. So hopefully it feels balanced here. But I learned a lot in the process, actually. And things that I thought I had forgotten a long time ago were actually right there. Just had to tap them a little bit more.
Does religion play a part in what you're doing in this respect, that local religious leaders probably being more patriarchal would be someone you would speak with to help with giving women a voice?
Religion plays an important part in many of the societies where we work. It's always been interesting to me in terms of Rwanda, where you had the church was heavily implicated in the genocide. And in fact, you had a lot of people running to churches for sanctuary, but actually 30% of the killings took place in around churches, often at the hands of clergy or nuns. And so you have that strange dynamic where the church is implicated, but it's also a source of recovery and support in the aftermath of the genocide. And I think to lesser and greater extents, it plays a role in many other societies as well. You have the Catholic Church, which is playing a very dominant role in Congo, and not necessarily in a good way. And so it really varies country by country and culture by culture. But, a lot of women carry a lot of spirituality. It helps them survive and to move on. And so we're really respectful of that one way or another. And particularly since, like at Women for Women, a lot of the groups that we work with, you're combining religions that were very combative with each other, that were the source of conflict, or ethnicities together that were at odds with each other. And so, how do you work through those dynamics in a way that helps women move to a better place? And in terms of engaging religious leaders, there's some of them are more receptive than others. And so we really try and find those religious leaders in each country who understand what we're trying to do and are supportive of that.
I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about how you got started with Women for Women and how you ended up in that space and doing the work that you've been doing.
That is a good question. Thank you, David. I spent 15 years working in the former Soviet Union. I helped women work to transition from a plan to a market economy, and got very enamored with what was possible when you were focused on transforming the lives of women and what that meant for the rest of their families. And so I got hired away by Women for Women International and spent 10 years there, and then transitioned to the Aquila Institute. And, you know, after that work with Women for Women, I really told myself, that was a personal commitment that I wanted to continue working to advance women wherever I went. That was, whether it was internationally, domestically, that I had learned enough that told me that this was the right way to focus my time and energy. But the things that I've learned, you know, whether it's in, you know, Russia, Belarus, Moldova, Afghanistan, Iraq, Congo, the threads, the continuity were very, very similar country to country. I mean, feminism may look different, how women engaged with each other or with other men or the community may have looked different, but the things that motivated women, their challenges were very similar across the board.
So I guess I just know from like the past that a lot of like education, like people going further in education, is a lot of it is the poverty aspect of it and not like being successful in that. So like initially, how did you guys combat that to like show women that education is a good way to, a good way to like,
to make it even
excel.
affordable for women to be able to get an education.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. When Aquila first started, we're actually celebrating our 10th year this year. We started with, you know, 3 classrooms and 50 young women, and everybody said, you know, you're a school for poor girls, because we didn't charge, or if we charged anything, it was like a tiny amount of money. And as we grew and became more professional, we started charging women to go to school. But what we did, because there wasn't a financing mechanism available, we created a first loan fund. And so women could finance the cost of their education through this loan fund. And what we did to make sure that it was accessible and affordable to students of all different socioeconomic backgrounds was we covered the cost to serve, what it actually cost to serve, and what we were charging these young women with philanthropy, so that we could keep that price and still keep that price low. And so we still do that today. Now, we've worked really hard to close that gap by slowly raising the cost of tuition, but also trying to be more efficient and spread our fixed cost over more students so that we could meet in the middle, so that we could close the gap in terms of what we need for philanthropy. But I personally feel that the cost of education shouldn't be so prohibitive that young women from wherever you come from should lose out on that opportunity, and we still feel that today.
Hello.
Hello.
So I know that a big part of the Rwandan constitution in 2003 in the interest of sustainability and reconciliation was to mandate that 30% of governing officials had to be women. And now it's, I think, close to 50 or just approaching. Comparing it to here in the States, does political opportunity in Rwanda equal economic opportunity? Or how do they reconcile that?
That's a great question. So it's about 63% in terms of women who are involved in, you know, government, whether they be at a ministerial level, or in members of parliament, or even local leadership. So it's a pretty significant percentage. And I think alongside that, the government has really worked to create economic opportunities for women. I think you still have challenges. I mean, Rwanda is still a developing country, and you still have a sort of a great dichotomy between how people live in Kigali and how people live outside of the capital city, which is why when I said, you know, the majority of working women actually still are earning, you know, under $2 a day and working as farmers. So, I mean, the government has worked very hard to, you know, Vision 2020 and Vision 2050 to have a plan and a strategy for moving not just women, but everybody, young people, men, to off-farm jobs and building a knowledge-based economy. And so the country is seeing like 7% growth rates and really doubling down in some key sectors like information and communications technology, doing conventions and summits and other things there where you're attracting a lot of outside people. It's a small country. It's 12.2 million people. It's landlocked. They don't have any natural resources to speak of. It's never going to be a big ag country, so they've had to get really creative about how they're growing the economy and how they're creating opportunities for women and men. But I think they've realized very smartly that, the economic opportunity is going to be so important to the country's future stability. And so they've worked really hard to create those economic opportunities for men and women.
For one more, if anyone has a last question.
So I'm curious, my background is in nonprofit storytelling, and I'm currently studying international development, and I think there's a lot to think there about the danger of telling a single story and how we talk about the people that we serve. And so I'm curious, like, how you think about that in terms of, like, both philanthropy and speaking and writing the book, obviously.
Well, there isn't a single story. I mean, everybody's got a story, and I think these are just a handful of stories. And lest anybody think that these are stories of all women who had great success and were able to transform their lives, there's a lot of women who have not been able to do that. And so I think you just need to make room for everybody's story. And I think for women to tell their own stories. I don't claim to speak on behalf of all women, or even women in Rwanda, or even the handful of women that I came across. I think it's a collection of stories of people that personally touched me, and that I thought might be helpful in terms of sort of understanding a little bit more about women's perspectives and choices, not only in Rwanda, but from different countries. But ideally, women are telling their own stories.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.